The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Now, across South Asia, we are increasingly witnessing governments using the law to curtail dissenters, clamp down on civil society organizations, and curb the free press. Tonight's conversation will look at a few key laws that are most employed to stifle dissent and muffle free speech, thereby challenging the very foundations of democracy. We'll also talk about how these laws are legitimized and made acceptable, how these laws run counter to international conventions. We'll also talk about the role of the judiciary in upholding democratic values. I'm so pleased to welcome to the studio Bhavani Fonseka, senior researcher from the Center for Policy Alternatives. Good evening and welcome, Bhavani.
Thank you, Sonali.
Bhavani, let's first talk about how it's so important to ensure a landscape where free speech is possible, but where it doesn't impinge on others' freedoms. Specifically, the case of rabble rousing by religious leaders, political leaders, individuals resorting to speech that could potentially incite. So we really need to look at the national, racial, religious dimensions. Speak to us about how dangerous it is to have individuals and groups inciting.
Well, Sonali, I think that's a very important question, very timely considering what we've seen in the recent past. Specifically what's happened in the areas, I think in the last couple of days, we've seen media clips where individuals have made comments, rather insightful comments, and I think there are now politicians who raised a complaint with the authorities in terms of particular incident. Now, this is not an isolated incident. I would say you need to look at Sri Lanka's history, especially in the post-war years, but even over the decades. But post-war years, we've seen 2014, 2017, 2018, 2019, particularly big incidents, which has led to incitement and then ethno-religious violence, particularly targeting Muslim communities, but minorities on the whole. Now, all these instances we've been looking at, none of the perpetrators of inciting violence, hostility, discrimination has been held to account. So there is a big issue of accountability. Now, ICCPR, that's the law in Sri Lanka, Section 3 provides for a particular act where national, racial, religious aspects which lead to incitement, that leads to hostility, discrimination, violence, action can be taken by the authorities. This law has been in the books since 2007. Now, it has been used in terms of arresting, detaining particular individuals. I think we need to talk about that in terms of how it has been used. But there's been instances where media has reported, these are publicly available information, where individuals who actually seemingly incite communities in terms of violence, in terms of hostility, no action has been taken. So there is an impunity enjoyed by some, and this is in a history where Sri Lanka has seen cycles of violence. It's a rich environment for something to really get out of hand. So it's important that state actors, authorities take action. But one also needs to remember that freedom of expression is provided in the Constitution. Freedom of expression is a bedrock of democracy. So people need to be able to speak freely. But the question is, what does free speech mean and where does it end up when it leads to violence? So there is a thin line that there is a law, not just under the ICCPR though, there are also other laws that can be used to hold people to account, such as penal code provisions. So there is an array of laws. I think the question is in Sri Lanka how it's used, abused, and in some instances not used.
If we take the ICCPR Act of Sri Lanka, which gets its name from the international convention with the same name, Section 3 specifically is meant to protect human rights and vulnerable groups from incitement to violence. However, over the recent past, we've seen the manner in which this act has been misused to target certain persons, certain people from different communities. So there has been a selective application of this act which is supposed to protect people. In fact, the former UN Special Rapporteur has said, and I quote, Sri Lanka's ICCPR Act has become a repressive tool curtailing freedom of thought or opinion, conscience and religion or belief. So to this list of persons whose rights were infringed, there are authors, poets, comedians, writers, students who acted in dissent of governments.
Well, it could also be that they're expressing an opinion. It may not even be a political comment. It could be that, you know, there are people who are raising concerns, and I think that's a very fundamental right.
Yeah.
People should be able to speak freely and play, you know, put their ideas, thoughts in the public domain. The question is, if it becomes violence, if it becomes something targeting a community or individual, then there is something to watch. But someone freely expressing their opinion is not a crime. It should not be a crime. So in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, over the recent years, especially we've seen recent arrest, detention of comedians, of writers, of poets. Now there's a whole list of them who've been targeted particularly. I worry that President is sending a clear message to people. We are watching what you write, what you say, what you speak, what you may say as satire. So if Sri Lanka, if a country doesn't have the appetite to have space for different opinions, for a space where people can agree to disagree, that is very, very worrying. That people should not be having a state, and this is coming from a Supreme Court judgment where the government, the state is the guardian of one's mind. That should not be the case. People should be freely able to express. The question is though, when an expression, when a speech becomes an instrument to target a community, target an individual, and unfortunately Sri Lanka also has seen this history. I mean, if you just look at the post-war years, 2014, 2018, 2019, we saw cycles of violence. Aludgama, Digana, post-Easter Sunday, these happen in instances where individuals were seen inciting violence. It's on record, this is not news. So there are two spectrums here. I think one is the ability to express, disagree, debate, very important for a functioning democracy. But the other dimension is where individuals, politicians, religious leaders, others could be using freedom of expression as a tool to target communities, and that's something to watch. But unfortunately, you're quite right, we haven't seen action being taken when there is actual evidence of individual inciting violence, and the law is there. You said it quite clearly, the law is there. The question is why successive governments, and not just this government, successive governments have been unable to check these practices. Because I think if there is accountability, perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, potential future perpetrators will know that there are repercussions by saying something, by taking certain steps. So unfortunately, in the context of impunity, you see a very fertile ground for incitement and violence.
Bhavani, as Sri Lankans, we need to collectively be so mindful of preventing ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic hurt, because we've seen a traumatized nation, 26 years of conflict, and the post-conflict era, so much of grief, so much of trauma. And if we still haven't learnt our lesson, our responsibility to ensure and enable non-recurrence of conflict, I don't know what more we can think, say. So could you bring in this dimension of police action, police inaction, because I think to this debate that is of crucial importance, because you go to law enforcement when you're aggrieved, when you seek redress.
Yes, and that's a good question in terms of what is it that a citizen can do at a time where there is clear evidence. I mean, when it's in the media, when it's on social media, what do? So I think the one thing people resort to is make a complaint in the police, make a complaint in the Human Rights Commission. Now those are possibilities. The question is though, is any action taken in these instances? Unfortunately, what we've seen in the past is very slow action or inaction by the authorities. That needs to be questioned. But funnily and not so surprisingly, when individuals make complaints against comedians, that there is some action, and you do wonder. Now recently, this year, we saw a comedian being arrested, and on the basis of what? An individual making a complaint on satire. But there was action taken. So I think there are double standards here. You have evidence where there is enough information when religious leaders incite violence against minorities. This is not just something that happened just this year. It's happened over the years. The question is, how many times have the authorities arrested a religious leader? I don't think there are too many cases. Now, I'm not saying just go and arrest every religious leader. That's not what I'm saying. When there is sufficient evidence that any individual, be it a politician or a religious leader, if there's evidence to show there is incitement, there has to be action taken. But what has happened is, when there is a complaint made on something a person has written in a book or a poem or a comment, a satire, then suddenly action is taken. So I do worry this double standard. It sends a very worrying sign to the people as well as the perpetrators, that they can get away with incitement that could lead to violence, that has led to violence, but the authorities are very fast in acting when it's something that's written in a book which is satire. So I do worry the inaction on some instances and the action on some instances.
Let's also, Bhavani, talk about the spate of laws that have been coming about, the Online Safety Bill, the Anti-Terrorism Act, so many new laws, despite Sri Lanka having a plethora of laws to deal with instances. What do we do when we feel like the laws that are meant to protect citizens are being used to weaponize?
So one thing is, I think citizens, every citizen has to be engaged. It's extremely important to be active, to scrutinize, to engage, to debate, to challenge. That's fundamental. And I think what we saw last year is citizens doing that. The Aragale showed that spirit of agency within the citizen and them challenging and get into the streets, literally. But I think it's also very important that one engages with policymakers, one engages with the government. So when there are proposals, for example, just this year, I think we've seen a host of proposals. We saw the anti-terror, the first bill coming up in March, April. We then saw a proposal on the Broadcasting Regulatory Commission. We then subsequently saw another updated version of the anti-terror, the ATA bill. Then we saw the Online Safety Bill. Now, just this year. And I think with all of this, it's exhausting at one level, but what was heartening is that people came and engaged and debated to a point where the government had to withdraw the anti-terror bill in April. Then recently also the minister has said he's going to withdraw. So that's a good indicator that citizens have really engaged and pushed and challenged. Many came to the Supreme Court to challenge the online safety bill. I think that's a very important sign.
46 petitions.
45, I think. Anyway, there were quite a large number. I think that these are good indicators that citizens are now becoming much more engaged in policy making, in law making. But the fact that the government keeps churning these things is also worrying. Now, worrying because what they're proposing is, if implemented, could impact freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, basic freedoms that we take for granted. So I think it's so important to study this, to write, to critique, but also realize that it's not going to end. This is going to continue. This comes at a time in 2022, the government did introduce emergency 3 times, use the PTA.
Right.
So it's sending a message, and we are going into an election year next year. It could be that there could be more laws that are introduced, but there is, worryingly, I feel, Sonali, there is the potential for more incitement, more ethno-religious violence. That could be distractions. We've seen it in the past, and I feel it's going to happen into the future.
Your points bring me to this doctrine called the shock doctrine. Actually, Dr. Arjuna Parakrama spoke about this yesterday on the show. The shock doctrine by Canadian social activist Naomi Klein. She speaks about the exploitation of national crises like disasters or upheavals to establish controversial and questionable policies, while citizens are too distracted either emotionally or physically to engage and develop an adequate response and resist effectively. I mean, this is a crazy doctrine, a crazy theory. What do you think?
Well, if you look at Sri Lanka's recent history, I think it's very relevant. Look at what happened in 2019. I mean, we had the Easter Sunday attacks, unfortunate, devastating, so many people died. What we've seen subsequently is that it could have been prevented. But the Easter Sunday attacks, what it resulted in was fear among people. 10 years after the end of the war, people were seeing violence. And it created suspicion. And suddenly we had, and people remember this, is that this demand for a strong leader emanating. So you have instances that result in violence and uncertainty and fear. And that results in people emotionally making decisions. And what happened in April 2019 had an impact in November 2019 with the elections, because people were influenced by that fear to vote for a candidate. That fear decided also what happened in parliament elections the next year. So it has a long impact. Now I fear that what we are seeing now, this incitement, it's not just one individuals. We are seeing a spate of efforts at ethno-nationalism, of targeting of minorities, of land appropriation. Now these are being documented. This is not something that is hypothetical. It's happening on the ground. Now if this continues into the next couple of months, we are likely to have, we should be having a presidential election next year. What does that mean? We are still in an economic situation where people are facing hardships. So I feel there's distractions that could be needed by certain politicians, certain vested actors, and I think what's happening on the ground shouldn't be seen in a vacuum. So I think it's very important, considering our history, what we have seen in the past, the potential for new triggers, that action is taken immediately. The president can take action. There is a whole spate of ministers. There is a police. There is a judiciary. The Attorney General's department should be taking action. Now, I say that also knowing that some of these institutions are politicized. They may not take action, but that's why the citizens need to demand action is taken so that the violence, the discrimination doesn't get out of control.
Bhavani, I feel like Sri Lankans need to stop being so resilient, need to stop being so hyper vigilant, and need to stop living in survival mode, because it's one crisis after the other. So you're always trying to manage, trying to fix things, and trying to just make it to the other day, the next day. Whereas we deserve to live with some stability of mind and have a stable economy and depend on our government and our state service. We need to be able to live a life of softness, don't you think?
Of course, I think we definitely need more stability, less uncertainty, and this kind of worry as to what the next crisis is. Definitely, I agree. But I think for that, you need some basic fundamentals. You need a government that's secure, that doesn't resort to efforts at targeting particular communities or actors who are critical, or resorting to exceptional laws that are used to target, to create fear. You need a government that's also stable. That's one. You need citizens who are responsible, that also doesn't allow politicians, business entities and other vested actors to create narratives. And I think this is where we have to play a very important role. And this is, I say it knowing that Sri Lankans have continued to play an important role. I'm not saying people have been complacent. It's the contrary. Last year, I think, gave everyone hope that people will stand up for democracy, for the rule of law. But what it shows is that the road is very long and it's very bumpy. And I think in the next couple of months leading up to elections, there's going to be a lot of things, I think, thrown our way. So we unfortunately don't have a situation where we can sit back. We will have to continuously monitor and critique, challenge, but at the same time demand for a situation, for a context where we don't need to go from crisis to crisis. And for those things, those are long-term reforms. That's a longer term project. So while we firefight, we can't lose sight that we need to have a situation, we need to have a vision for a country that doesn't go from crisis to crisis. So it's a lot of things we need to do, but I would say it's not impossible considering what we have achieved. We have achieved quite a bit, but so much more needs to be done, and that's the daunting task.
Bhavani, my final question is that, so there's the civil society, the citizenry, and at the other end of the spectrum are the policymakers. And by and large, policymakers through successive governments have been considered the bad guys who don't really care about the people. How do we bridge this disconnect? For example, this program, I don't think a single policymaker will be watching it. So the audiences that watch this show will be nodding vigorously saying, yes, that's what needs to be done. But the policymakers are the ones who need to be watching it and saying, oh, really? Yeah, perhaps, So how do we bridge this gap, this disconnect? How do we engage with people who are not like-minded?
So it's not easy, but I would just go back to the examples I used in terms of the policymakers trying to bring laws this year. And that's where I always say we need to think of the victories we've had. The policymakers did try to bring the ATA twice this year. People pushed back. The policymakers try to bring the Broadcasting Regulatory Commission, the people push back. So I think it's important for the policymakers to realize they can't work within their bubble and ignore the citizenry. If anything, we don't want a repeat of last year where the government needs to go home because they lose the trust of the people. So the policymakers, I think, have come to a situation where they realize they need to listen to the people, but they need constant reminding that they need to listen to the people, that they need to uphold the Constitution, they need to protect our democracy. They constantly need to remember this and be reminded of this. So it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think we just have to use different ways, creative ways, but peaceful ways of engaging policymakers. Agree to disagree sometimes. That's fine. I think we need to recognize that not everyone's going to be on the same page. That's fine. But we need to have the space to have the debates, responsibly engage. And I think it's important for the government, the policymakers, and the elites to realize that you can't work in a vacuum. If you work in your own bubble, you're going to lead to a situation where there could be unrest uprising. We've seen this in our past. Let's avoid that. Engage, listen, and try to work towards something that addresses people's concerns. So we are going to see electricity prices increase. We are going to see the budget debates happening. We are going to see possibly further uncertainty on the economic front. But unfortunately, what we are also seeing is ethno-religious violence, tension, triggers that could lead to new violence. So the headlines are there. The trends are clearly set out. What is the policymaker, what is the government going to do with all of this? We will have to see, but it's important these shows put the information out there so that the citizen is aware and they can demand also for accountability.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Bhavani Fonseka.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.
The People's Platform.